Alright, hello everyone, Sidewin here. Today I am going to be talking about weapon specialization effects on a what you need to know basis. So, first off here, who gets access to these weapon specialization effects? If you browse around on Archives and Ethos, you probably know that all of the weapons have a critical specialization effect down below. That's what I'm talking about today. And you might also note that your class doesn't really mention it at first level or anytime around there. Well, the answer is many martial classes, such as Fighter and Rogue, gain these effects whenever they deal a critical hit. These are features that usually trigger around 5th level. The classes that I know for sure have something along these lines are Rogue, Fighter, Swashbuckler, Ranger, and Barbarian. Some of these have conditions, such as the Barbarians only applying when raging, and the Rangers only really applying against hunted prey. However, it's still good to know how these work, as any of them, because quite simply, you will probably trigger them eventually with those 5 classes. And I'm putting this in a separate video from the classes because, well, I don't want to repeat myself 6 times. And I think you agree here, that's probably a little too much. Alright, so what do these do? Basically, it's just a rider effect. It's just a rider effect on a critical hit. So these effects vary in usefulness and in damage, or in what other conditions they impose, by the weapon group. Basically, every single weapon in Pathfinder is put into one of several groups, such as knife, or axe, or bow, or firearm, and then they have that critical specialization effect. All of the weapons are pretty much only sorted into one group, although they might look like multiple, and I think there might be some special rule of combination weapons. But that's unlikely to come into effect here. So at this point, I'm going to go into and talk a little bit about what each of the critical specialization effects is for each of the groups. I've paired some of these together because they're the same for 2 different groups. Alright, so the first one's Axe. Essentially, Axe lets you deal additional damage to a second target whenever you deal a critical hit. The way this works is that you select a second target within your reach. So basically, if you have 2 foes standing next to each other, you roll a critical hit, then you get to affect the second foe, rather than just affecting the first. And you immediately deal damage equal to the sum of the weapon damage dice you rolled, including any striking runes you may have. You do not add any bonuses or double the damage. So if you rolled a 20 damage, then you deal 20 damage, even though your actual critical damage is 40 something, because you also get to add strength. This damage is dealt with the axe so long as your roll is higher than the second target's AC, which will almost certainly be the case if you dealt a critical hit. The second one is Bow. This one is sort of a utility thing, but again, you can't rely on triggering any of these unless you're a crit fetching fighter, because there's some ways to pull that off. So the way this critical specialization works is that so long as your target is adjacent to a surface, so like a floor or a ceiling, this doesn't work in underwater combat usually, or when you're flying, both of which are rarer scenarios. Basically, it immobilizes your target until it succeeds on a DC 10 athletics check. Succeeding on it takes 1 action. One of the limitations of this is it only works on corporal targets with defined forms, so you can't go around pinning an ooze or a ghost or anything like that. Alright, Brawling. These weapons are less common, but basically they're punching someone. Most of them are fists and gauntlets. Basically, what it does is it forces a fortitude save against your class DC. Should the target fail, you impose slowed 1 until the end of your next turn. This is an action-reducing ability. Think like the slow spell. Club. This allows you to impose 10 feet of force movement away from you. Basically, you smack the target and send them flying. It's pretty simple. Crossbow. This one gets into a rule that's a little less commonly known, but it deals an extra 1d8 plus the number on your potency rune persistent bleeding damage. So the way that persistent bleed damage works is basically you shoot someone and they're bleeding, so it continues to deal damage. At the end of the target's turn, it forces a DC 15 flat check. On a success, they are no longer bleeding. Until that success is achieved, they're still bleeding. Their ally can also perform first aid to stop it. Dart and knife, these have the exact same effect. And it's almost the same as the crossbow, it's just 1d6 plus potency as opposed to 1d8 plus potency. Same rules. So for the firearm and the sling weapon groups, it forces a fortitude save versus class DC again. And on a failure, it imposes stunned 1. Another condition. You can look up all these conditions on AON, and I will put these in the description. Alright, Flail. This is a forced reflex save. On a failure, impose prone condition, so basically flat on the floor. Hammer does the exact same thing as a flail, except you are imposing a fortitude save rather than a reflex save. Pick. This lets you deal +2 damage per damage die. So if you have 4 damage die, then you get to deal +8 damage. For the shield and the polearm, you impose 5 feet of force movement. With the polearm, you can move them any direction around you. With the shield, it has to be away from you. So like the polearm, you can just shift someone 5 feet around you. Spear. You impose clumsy 1 until the start of your next turn. This does not force a save, it's just imposed. Sword. This is the last one. Imposes flat-footed until the start of your next turn. Also, no save. So that's all of them. And back to the beginning here, as you can see, I do not really have anything to summarize here. So if you have questions on these, feel free to ask. There's specific strategies for picking a weapon based off these, but it only really applies if you know you're going to be critical hitting, like a lot, which is mostly a fighter thing. And even then, you can't rely on it. So keep that in mind. These all sound very, very, very awesome, but you don't trigger them often.